Father, her child is freezing. How one father and child saved stranded aliens. The wind howled across the frozen plains of a distant planet, carrying with it the bite of bitter cold that made it hard to breathe. The sun barely touched the horizon, casting an eerie, dim light over the endless stretch of white. Jack, a seasoned explorer, trudged through the thick snow, his breath forming icy clouds in the air. His daughter Mia walked beside him, her small steps quick and determined, despite the freezing wind that threatened to slow them down. They had been on this mission for weeks, charting unexplored territory, looking for resources to help sustain human life on new planets. This frozen world was no exception, though Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. There was something about the silence of the place, the emptiness, that seemed wrong. He pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the task at hand. "Do you think we'll find anything today, Dad?" Mia's voice was a whisper against the harsh wind, but Jack could hear her clearly. Her brown eyes were wide with curiosity, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "We'll find something, Mia," Jack said, trying to sound confident, though the doubts lingered in his mind. "We always do." They walked for hours, the snow crunching beneath their boots, their faces growing numb with the cold. Jack was starting to think it was time to turn back when Mia stopped suddenly, her eyes fixed on something ahead. Jack followed her gaze and froze. There, half buried in the snow, was a ship. It was small but clearly foreign, the sleek design unlike anything Jack had ever seen. The ship's metal was dull from the cold, and there was a gaping hole in the side, as if it had crashed. The engines were silent, and the ship's lights were off, as though it had been abandoned for a long time. Jack's heart raced as he glanced at Mia, who was already moving toward the ship, her feet light in the snow. "Wait, Mia," he called, but she didn't stop. His voice was caught in the wind, lost before it could reach her. Jack cursed under his breath, his protective instincts kicking in. He ran after her, reaching her just as she neared the ship. "Dad, look!" Mia pointed toward the open hatch, her face filled with both wonder and concern. "Someone's inside." Jack's heart skipped a beat as he peered into the darkened opening of the ship. The inside was dim, the air cold, but Jack could make out two figures lying motionless in the shadows. One appeared to be an adult, while the other was smaller, possibly a child. "Stay here, Mia," Jack ordered softly, his hand gripping the back of her coat. "I'll go check." He pulled his communicator from his jacket and sent a signal to their base camp, but the response was nothing more than static. The storm had likely interfered with the signal. Jack's stomach sank. He couldn't rely on outside help. With a deep breath, Jack moved toward the ship, careful of his footing in the snow. The hatch groaned as he pulled it open, the cold air rushing out in a gust that made him shiver. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old, cold metal and something else, something faintly sweet. He moved quickly, his boots making soft crunches against the floor as he approached the two figures. They were both humanoid, their skin pale, almost translucent under the dim light. The adult was slumped against the wall, its chest barely rising and falling. The child lay next to her, curled up, shivering violently. Hey, are you okay?" Jack's voice was calm, but his heart was racing. The mother's eyes fluttered open, revealing large, round pupils that shimmered in the dark like deep pools of liquid. Her gaze locked onto him for a moment before she struggled to sit up. "Please," her voice was weak, barely a whisper. "Help, my child!" Jack knelt beside her, looking between the mother and the child. The child's skin was turning a sickly shade of blue, its lips cracked from cold. Jack's mind raced. He didn't have the proper medical supplies on him for something like this, and the base was too far away. But they had to get them to safety. He glanced over his shoulder at Mia, who had followed him inside. Her eyes were wide, and she was holding her breath as she watched the scene unfold. Jack turned back to the aliens, his mind working quickly. He had to make a decision, and he had to make it now. "We need to get them to shelter," he muttered to himself. "I'll carry her." "You take the child." Mia nodded without hesitation, moving closer to the child. She gently scooped the small alien into her arms, careful not to jostle it too much. Jack lifted the adult alien as best he could, her body stiff from the cold, her breathing shallow but steady. "We're going to get you help," Jack said as he turned toward the exit. "Just hold on." They didn't have much time. The storm was getting worse, the winds howling like beasts in the distance. Jack stepped carefully back into the snow, Mia close behind. The cold bit at his exposed skin, and the weight of the two aliens felt heavy in his arms. But he didn't stop. They couldn't stop. As they made their way back toward their shelter, Jack's thoughts raced. Who were these beings? How had they ended up stranded on this icy world? And more importantly, would they survive long enough to find out? Jack moved quickly through the snow, his breath coming in sharp, visible clouds. The cold was biting, but it wasn't just the weather that gnawed at him. It was the weight of the two alien beings he was carrying. He glanced down at the alien woman in his arms. Her body was stiff, her breathing shallow. He could feel the chill radiating off of her, and his mind raced with worry. Would she make it? Would they both make it? Behind him, Mia was struggling to keep up. She was carrying the small alien child, her arms wrapped tightly around its fragile form. Jack glanced over his shoulder to check on her, his eyes searching for signs of exhaustion. She was shivering, but her determination was clear. She wasn't about to let go of the child. She had an unshakable resolve, and Jack couldn't be prouder of her in that moment. "We're almost there, Mia," Jack called out, his voice muffled by the wind. "Keep moving." Mia nodded, though her lips were blue from the cold. She gripped the child tighter, her small body struggling under the weight. But she didn't complain. She kept going, one step after another, as if she was driven by a force that was more than just survival. Jack knew it was the same force that had made her stop and call out when she saw the crashed ship. The same force that made her reach out to the aliens with nothing but kindness in her heart. They made it to their shelter after what felt like hours. The door groaned as Jack pushed it open, the warmth inside rushing out to meet them. He quickly stepped in, Mia right behind him. The air inside was thick with the smell of cooked food, but Jack couldn't appreciate it right now. He was too focused on the aliens in his arms. They had to get them warm fast. Mia placed the child on the floor, gently lowering it onto a blanket. Jack followed her lead, laying the alien woman down as carefully as he could. The warmth of the shelter felt like a distant memory, the cold from outside still clinging to their bodies. Jack quickly moved to the medical kit, pulling out what he could. He had basic supplies, nothing fancy. He wasn't a doctor, and these weren't just regular humans. He had no idea what kind of physiology these beings had, but there was no time to figure that out. He had to do something. He wrapped the alien woman in blankets and placed a heated pad near her body, hoping it would help warm her up. Mia was working just as quickly, rubbing the small alien child's limbs to stimulate circulation. Jack could hear her soft voice talking to the child in a language she didn't know. It was the only comfort she could offer, but it seemed to work. The child's shivering started to slow, and its eyes fluttered open, staring up at Mia with curiosity. Jack sat back on his heels, taking a deep breath. It was far from ideal, but they had bought the aliens some time. Now they just needed to hold on. The alien woman's eyes fluttered open. Jack noticed how different her eyes were, large and almond-shaped, a dark, rich color that seemed to shimmer in the low light. She gazed at him, her expression faint but filled with gratitude. Her voice was weak but still audible. "Thank you," she said, her accent foreign, but the words were clear. Jack nodded, his throat tight. "You're safe now," he said softly. "You'll be okay." Mia looked up from the child, her eyes meeting Jack's. "What do you think happened to them?" she asked quietly. Jack sighed, running a hand through his frozen hair. "I don't know, Mia, but we'll figure it out. For now, we focus on keeping them alive." They didn't have much food left in the shelter, and the storm was still raging outside. Jack knew that if the weather didn't clear soon, they'd be trapped here. They couldn't afford to waste time, but he also couldn't leave the aliens out there to die. They were the only ones who could understand what had happened to their ship, and possibly they were the only ones who could help Jack and Mia get off this planet. The alien woman spoke again, her voice faint but more forceful now. "My child needs warmth and food. We have supplies in the ship." Jack's brow furrowed. "How far is the ship?" he asked. He wasn't sure they could make another trip out in this storm, especially not with the aliens in their current condition. She paused for a long moment, her eyes closing briefly. When she spoke again, her voice was soft. "It's not far, but you must hurry." Jack exchanged a glance with Mia. She seemed to be thinking the same thing. They couldn't leave the aliens alone, not with the storm still raging outside. But if they didn't find food and better shelter soon, there was a chance they'd all freeze. They had to take the risk. "All right," Jack said, his voice firm. "We'll go get your supplies. You stay here and rest. We'll be back soon." The alien woman nodded weakly, and Jack helped Mia bundle her up in blankets. The child was still weak but breathing easier now, its eyes drifting closed as if it was finally starting to feel safe. Jack turned to Mia. "You stay here with them," he said. "I'll go out alone." Mia shook her head, her lips trembling. "No, Dad, we're a team. We do this together." Jack hesitated. He knew how dangerous it was, but he also knew Mia wasn't going to let him go alone. They were in this together, just like always. "Okay," he said, taking a deep breath. "But we have to move quickly." They bundled up in their warmest clothes, preparing to face the storm again. The wind howled outside, the snow whipping against the shelter's walls. Jack glanced at the aliens one last time before stepping out into the cold. Mia followed closely behind, the weight of the task ahead of them heavy on her shoulders. Together, they would find the supplies, and hopefully they would also find answers to the questions that kept swirling in Jack's mind. How had these aliens ended up stranded on this planet? And more importantly, what was their connection to the fate of humanity? They couldn't waste any more time. The storm outside was relentless, the howling winds and thick snow making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Jack squinted into the whiteout, his breath clouding in the freezing air. His heart raced, not just from the cold, but from the uncertainty of what lay ahead. He and Mia had barely made it to their shelter earlier. Now they were headed back out into the storm to search for supplies the aliens desperately needed. Mia, walking closely behind him, kept her head down to shield her face from the biting wind. The child she was carrying had settled into her arms, still shivering but breathing a little easier. Jack could see how hard it was for her, her small frame struggling against the weight of the alien child, but she didn't complain. "Stay close, Mia," Jack said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. She nodded silently, her eyes focused on the path ahead. They had to find the alien ship quickly. It wasn't far, but in these conditions, every step felt like an eternity. The snow was thick underfoot, and each gust of wind made it harder to breathe. The world around them was blanketed in white, a sea of ice and snow with no end in sight. Jack's thoughts raced as he tried to keep moving, hoping the ship's wreckage would be close enough for them to reach before they froze. They trudged on in silence for what felt like hours. Jack kept his eyes on the horizon, barely able to make out the faint outline of the ship through the swirling snow. He glanced over his shoulder at Mia, who was still holding the child close, her face flushed from the cold. She was struggling to keep her footing, but she didn't stop. Jack knew Mia would never give up, not as long as she had someone to protect. Finally, they reached the ship. Jack could just make out the twisted metal and broken pieces of the craft in the distance. It was a small relief to see it, even though the wreckage only confirmed what they already knew. The ship had been through hell. The hull was deeply scarred, parts of it twisted and broken beyond recognition. Snow had piled up around the wreck, covering much of it, but there was a small entrance that Jack could see through the cracks in the ship's side. "Stay here," Jack said to Mia, his voice stern but soft. "I'll go in first. You keep the child safe." Mia didn't argue. She simply nodded, stepping back against the ship's icy surface. Jack moved quickly toward the entrance, careful not to slip on the icy ground. He didn't know what they would find inside. Would there be more survivors, more supplies? Or had the crash been too much for everyone aboard? The hatch creaked as he pushed it open, the metal groaning under the pressure. Inside, the air was cold, the ship's heating system completely shut down. But there was still a faint smell of fuel and machinery, a reminder that the ship had been a functioning vessel once. Jack stepped cautiously into the dimly lit interior, squinting as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. The walls were scorched, and debris was scattered everywhere. The ship had definitely seen better days. He moved deeper into the ship, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. As he walked, he called out softly, but the only sound was the hiss of the wind outside. There were no signs of movement, no voices. Jack's heart sank. Had everyone else made it off the ship in time? Or were they all gone? Then, in the distance, Jack saw something that made him freeze. A faint glow. It was soft, almost like a flicker of light. Cautiously, he moved toward it, his pulse quickening. The glow came from a small, sealed compartment at the back of the ship. Jack's mind raced. Was there something, or someone inside? He reached the compartment and gently pried open the door. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Inside the compartment, a stash of supplies was neatly organized, though covered in dust. There were food rations, water, medical kits, and a small heat generator, the kind used to keep supplies warm in freezing conditions. Jack breathed a sigh of relief. This was exactly what they needed. Without wasting another moment, he grabbed the supplies, carefully packing them into the bag he had brought. But as he turned to leave, his eyes caught something else, a small alien device glowing faintly in the corner. It looked like some kind of communicator or perhaps a data storage unit. Jack hesitated, wondering if it might hold information about the crash, about the aliens' mission. He took a deep breath and picked it up, tucking it safely into his coat pocket. It might help them understand more about what had happened here. Jack turned and hurried back to where Mia was waiting. She was standing against the ship, the alien child still in her arms, its eyes fluttering open and closed. She was shivering, but her focus was entirely on the child. Jack could see how much she cared for it. It made him proud, but also a little worried. They hadn't been out here long, but it already felt like the storm was taking its toll on them both. "Dad, did you find it?" Mia asked, her voice hoarse from the cold. Jack nodded, lifting the bag of supplies. "I found enough, but we need to hurry back. It's getting worse out here." Mia nodded, her lips trembling. She adjusted the child in her arms, and Jack could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't going to let anything happen to this child, not if she could help it. Together, they made their way back to the shelter, the storm still raging around them. The wind whipped at their faces, the snow falling in thick sheets. But this time, Jack wasn't as worried. They had what they needed to survive. They had a chance. By the time they reached the shelter, Mia was exhausted, her face pale from the cold. But she didn't complain. She handed the alien child to Jack as he entered the warmth of the shelter, and together they laid the child down, wrapping it in the blankets and checking its temperature. It was still weak, but it was no longer shivering as violently. Jack pulled out the medical supplies and began to examine the child carefully, trying to make sure it was stable. The supplies would help, but they needed to be careful. If the child was as fragile as it seemed, there was no room for error. He glanced at Mia, who was sitting beside the child, her eyes focused on it with the same intensity and care she had shown from the very beginning. "Do you think they'll make it, Dad?" Mia asked quietly, her voice barely audible. Jack paused for a moment, looking at the alien child. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy for any of them, but they had come this far. They had survived the worst of it, and together, with what they had learned about each other and about the aliens, they would keep going. They would find the answers they needed. "We'll make it," Jack said softly, his voice steady and reassuring. "We'll all make it." The storm outside had not let up, and the howling wind seemed to press against the walls of the shelter, making everything feel colder. Jack sat beside the fire, his eyes on the alien child as it slept. Mia was next to him, watching the small creature closely, her expression soft but worried. The supplies Jack had brought back from the wreckage were now scattered across the floor, the warmth from the fire starting to make a difference. The alien woman, who had been so weak when they first brought her in, was now awake and sitting up, though she still looked fragile. Her dark eyes were focused on Jack, following his every move. He had already done his best to keep her warm, and she seemed a little better now, though still not strong enough to move on her own. She was sitting quietly, the blankets wrapped tightly around her. Jack glanced at Mia, who was still holding the child, her hands gentle as she caressed its small, shivering form. He could see the concern on her face, and his heart ached. They had done everything they could for these aliens, but the storm was still making survival difficult. The lack of proper medical equipment made things worse. Jack wasn't sure how long they could keep going, especially if the storm continued. He had no way of knowing if anyone was coming to rescue them or if they were completely alone. He let out a deep breath, standing up and walking over to the small window in the shelter. The snow was thick outside, the world beyond completely hidden under a blanket of white. There was no way to know what the future held, but Jack knew that they had to keep moving forward. "They couldn't give up. We need to figure out what happened to their ship," Jack said quietly, more to himself than to Mia. "We need answers if we're going to get out of here." Mia looked up at him, nodding in agreement. "Do you think it's safe to go back to the ship?" "The storm is still so bad." Jack thought about it for a moment. "We don't have a choice. If we can find out more about their mission, maybe we can get help. Maybe they have a way to contact others. We have to try." Mia stood up and moved toward the child, gently setting it down on a bed of blankets. "I'll stay here with the child. You go, Dad, but be careful. We don't know what else could be out there." Jack gave her a reassuring smile, though he could feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders. "I'll be careful. You just make sure this little one is safe. I'll be back as soon as I can." He grabbed a coat and wrapped himself up, trying to block out the cold from his thoughts. The wind had picked up, and every step he took toward the door felt like it could be his last. But he had to go. The answers they needed were still out there, somewhere in the wreckage of that alien ship. The wind hit him like a wall as he stepped outside. His face was immediately stung by the cold, the sharpness of it biting into his skin. Jack squinted into the snow, trying to make out the outline of the ship through the haze. He had to push forward, step by step, his boots crunching in the snow with each movement. It felt like the storm was getting stronger with every passing minute, and Jack had to fight the urge to turn back. There was too much at stake. The aliens had to be saved, and if there was any chance of finding help, he had to take it. After what seemed like hours, Jack finally reached the wreckage. The ship was still half buried under the snow, but the entrance was visible just as it had been earlier. He approached it cautiously, his every step sinking into the thick snow. The cold gnawed at him, but he didn't stop. The wreckage was even more damaged up close. Jagged metal pieces jutted out from the hull, and everything was coated in a layer of frost. Jack took a deep breath and stepped into the ship. The familiar smell of old machinery and cold metal filled his nostrils. Inside, the air was still and heavy, the darkness broken only by the dim glow of emergency lights that flickered weakly. He moved through the ship, trying to remember where he had found the supplies earlier. The walls were scarred, and there was a thick layer of dust on everything. The ship had been through a lot, and it seemed to be falling apart piece by piece. As he moved deeper into the wreckage, Jack heard a faint sound, almost like a whisper. His body tensed, and he froze. Was someone here? Had the aliens been the only survivors? He listened closely, straining to hear anything that might give him a clue. The whisper came again, faint but clear. "Help!" Jack's heart skipped a beat. The voice sounded human, but how? He had assumed there were only aliens on the ship. His mind raced, but he didn't hesitate. He followed the sound, his footsteps quickening as he moved deeper into the ship. The voice led him to a small compartment at the back, where he found a human soldier lying unconscious on the floor, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Jack knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. It was faint, but the soldier was still alive. He quickly went through his supplies, pulling out what little medical equipment he had. He wasn't a trained medic, but he knew enough to keep the soldier stable until they could get him back to the shelter. He applied pressure to a wound on the man's leg and did his best to stop the bleeding. The soldier stirred but didn't wake. Jack's mind was racing. What was a human soldier doing on an alien ship? Had he been part of a larger mission? And why hadn't anyone come to rescue him? With no time to waste, Jack carefully lifted the soldier and made his way back to the shelter. The storm was still fierce, but the soldier was alive, and that was all that mattered. He would have to carry him back with the same urgency he'd carried the aliens. This was their chance to find out what had happened to the ship, and maybe, just maybe, there was a way to contact the outside world. He trudged back through the snow, the weight of the soldier in his arms slowing him down. The cold gnawed at him, the wind biting through his clothes, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The answers were too important. When he finally reached the shelter, Mia was waiting for him, her face etched with worry. Jack didn't waste any time. He laid the soldier down on a bed of blankets beside the fire, checking his vitals as best as he could. Mia looked at the soldier, then at Jack. "What happened? Who is he?" Jack sighed, rubbing his hands together to warm them. "I don't know yet. But I'm sure he's connected to the ship. He was alive, that's all that matters right now." The alien woman, still weak but alert, watched them carefully. Her dark eyes were fixed on the soldier, and there was a glimmer of recognition in her gaze. Jack turned to her. "Do you know him?" She shook her head, her expression unreadable. "No, but I know his kind. They are soldiers like the ones who attacked our planet." Jack's stomach twisted. Soldiers, what had happened here? What had the aliens been fighting? And how had this human ended up on the ship? They all sat in silence, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. Jack knew they had to find out the truth, but it felt like the storm outside was closing in, pushing them further into the dark. They couldn't stay here forever. As the fire crackled in the background, Jack made a vow. They would survive. They would uncover the truth. And somehow they would all get home. The storm outside had not let up, and the howling wind continued to batter the shelter. Inside, the warmth from the fire crackled, but Jack could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The alien woman, still weak but alert, lay on the floor beside the fire. The human soldier whom Jack had brought back from the wreckage was still unconscious but stable. Mia had been doing her best to keep the child comfortable, but Jack knew time was running out. They couldn't stay here much longer. They needed answers. Jack stood by the fire, rubbing his hands together to warm them. His thoughts were racing. Who were these people? What had happened to their ship? And why was there a human soldier on board? He had so many questions, but no answers. Yet the one thing he knew for certain was that they couldn't survive in the shelter forever. They needed to find a way off this planet, and they needed to do it soon. Mia was sitting beside the soldier, gently pressing a wet cloth to his forehead. The child was sleeping soundly now, its breathing steady. Jack watched her for a moment, his heart swelling with pride. She had been so strong through all of this, taking on more responsibility than any child should have to bear. He admired her courage. It reminded him why he couldn't stop now. They had to keep going for her and for the alien family they had taken in. "Mia, how's he doing?" Jack asked softly, his voice breaking the silence. Mia looked up at him, her expression tired but determined. "He's still out cold, but he's breathing better. His leg is still bleeding, but I've done what I can. I think he just needs rest." Jack nodded, rubbing his face with one hand. "Good, we can't afford to lose him. We need to figure out what happened to him and why he was on that ship." Mia didn't answer right away. She simply kept her eyes on the soldier, her brow furrowed in thought. Then she spoke, her voice quiet. "Do you think there are more survivors, more humans out there?" Jack's stomach tightened. He wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer, but he had to face the truth. "I don't know, but if there are, they might be out there somewhere, lost in this storm." Mia's eyes flickered with worry, but she didn't say anything else. She was strong, but Jack could see the fear in her eyes. They were all in danger. The cold was relentless, and the shelter they had was far from secure. They couldn't wait for help to come. They had to find a way to contact someone, or at least find a way off the planet. "I'll check on the ship again," Jack said, his voice steady. "We have to see if we can get the communication systems back up. Maybe there's still a chance to call for help." Mia's eyes widened. "But Dad, the storm, it's too dangerous." Jack hesitated, looking at the fire and then back at her. He knew she was right. The storm was still fierce, and there was no telling how long it would last. But they didn't have a choice. If they stayed here much longer, they would freeze. And with the soldiers' presence, Jack wasn't sure how safe the shelter was anymore. "I know, but we don't have time. I'll go alone. You stay here and watch over the others." Mia shook her head, standing up. "No, I'm coming with you." Jack opened his mouth to argue, but Mia cut him off. "You can't do it alone. We have to stick together. We always have." He looked at her for a moment, seeing the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had driven her to help the aliens without hesitation. She was right. They were in this together. There was no turning back. "All right," he said finally, his voice soft. "But we need to be quick. The longer we wait, the worse the storm gets." They quickly bundled up, preparing to face the cold once again. The wind howled outside, making everything feel distant and unreachable. Jack felt the weight of the world on his shoulders as he stepped outside, but Mia was right behind him, her steps firm in the snow. Together, they trudged through the blizzard, the snow whipping around them in every direction. Jack could barely see a few feet in front of him, but he knew the ship was close. He had to reach it. He had to find a way to get help. The cold bit at his skin, and the snow was thick underfoot, making every step feel like a struggle. The storm had grown even worse since he had left earlier, but he kept moving, focusing on the goal ahead. They had to reach the ship no matter what. Mia was right behind him, her breath visible in the freezing air. She was strong, but Jack could see the exhaustion in her face. This storm was taking a toll on them both. He wanted to turn around to tell her they should go back, but he knew they couldn't. Not yet. Finally, through the thick snow, they saw it, the wreckage of the ship. It looked even more damaged up close, the hull twisted and broken, parts of it buried under the weight of the snow. Jack's heart pounded as he approached the ship. The communication systems were their only chance to get help. He had to believe they were still functional. He reached the entrance to the ship, pushing the hatch open with all his strength. Inside, the ship was as dark and cold as before, the faint glow of the emergency lights casting eerie shadows across the walls. Jack stepped inside, Mia close behind him. "Stay alert," Jack whispered. "We don't know what we'll find." They made their way through the wreckage, Jack carefully navigating the twisted metal and scattered debris. It felt like they were walking through a graveyard, the silence broken only by the sound of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the ship's damaged frame. They reached the control room, and Jack immediately began working on the communication system. Mia stood nearby, keeping watch, her eyes darting from the shadows to the door. Jack's fingers moved quickly over the controls, but the system was unresponsive at first. His heart sank. Had the storm damaged it beyond repair? Had it all been for nothing? But then, with a flicker of hope, the screen lit up. A faint signal, barely readable, appeared on the monitor. It wasn't much, but it was something. He worked quickly, adjusting the settings until the signal grew stronger. A voice crackled through the speaker, garbled but clear enough to understand. "This is the Galactic Rescue Team. We've received your distress signal. Stand by for extraction." Jack's heart soared. They had done it. They had reached out and someone had heard them. They weren't alone anymore. The rescue team would come. Mia looked at Jack, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad, we did it." Jack smiled, relief washing over him. They had made it. They had survived. And now they were going home. But as Jack turned to leave, he looked back one last time at the wrecked ship and the alien woman they had saved. It had been a long, dangerous journey, but in the end, they had all found a way to survive. Together. The storm still raged outside, but inside there was hope. They were going to make it. They were going home.